Welcome to part 2 of topic 3, climate action. So for this video, we will be looking at how climate action actually climate change constrains sustainable development. Okay, we will be looking at some of these mitigation as well as other factors. So if you take a look at this image here, this actually shows you in a real world situation what are some of these constraints that are brought about because of climate change, right? So there are needs that we learned about humans needs earlier on in the year. So when you have climate change, these needs that have evolved over millions of years, uh, do then face some problems in humans' abilities to attain these needs. So they range from a whole myriad of parts of our lives, right? So if you look at in terms of food, when you have climate change, like when you have droughts, what can impact to the amount of food that's produced? Okay, how can it affect agricultural activity? Right? Will the productivity be as well as good? Okay, what happens when you have reduced productivity in agriculture systems? Will you have the population of the world adjusting immediately? Right? Eating less? Will the rich people have less wastage? Right? So what will happen to then even at the very base level to the farmers when you have such crop failures due to droughts or even due to flooding, right? Climate change. Okay, what will happen to the farmers? Will they be plunged into poverty? Right? What about reserves? Don't they have reserves or money stashed away in year times of good yield? Right? What if the climate change doesn't go away? Right? Will they have the ability, the technology to pivot, to mitigate? Okay, so we talked about mitigation strategies in the earlier video, part 1. So it's timely for you to take a moment and think about mitigation strategies. Is it cost free? Right? When we're looking at costs, is it only economic costs? Okay, so secondly, let's look at residential and other developments that are coastal. Right, when you have climate change, you have increased coastal flooding, or worse still, you have increase in sea level. Right, sea level rising. What will happen to coastal cities? Okay, we're not talking about one or two person's houses here. We're looking at the entire cities that are coastal bound. Okay, most if not all of the major metropolises in the world are coastal bound because the climatic conditions are just way much better. So you think about what we covered earlier on in the topic in climate when we learn about maritime and continental effect. Okay, so with that in mind, would you want to live in the landlocked areas if you had a choice, okay, and enjoy the very harsh climate? Or would you want to live in um, the coastal areas where you get to enjoy maritime effect? So what happens when everybody lives by the sea and then there's sea level rise? Okay, if you think about sea level rise being, it's not very significant, right? It's like 1 2 cm. What if it isn't 1 2 cm? What if it's 1 cm every 10 years? Within your lifespan, it would have gone up 9, 8 cm. 8 centimeters is a very, very, very significant increase, right? 8 centimeters will mean that your water will have covered your ankles at least. Okay, that is not a problem if you live on the second floor. What if you live on the ground floor? Right? What if you have crops that are on the ground floor? What if you have vegetation? Moving on, if you look at further out at sea, what about the marine life? When you have climate change, when you have increase in temperatures, right? It's not only ambient temperature that we're looking at, there may be increase in water temperature as well. Okay, so similarly, there are sensitive marine life and marine animals like corals that are very sensitive to this, and when they go through climate change, they may not survive, and there are greater implications on that. So when we're looking at corals, how sensitive are these? Right? What happens when your corals die? What is the larger impact? This is something that you need to be sure of, you need to be clear about, and hopefully this video will allow you to see the implications, second tier and third tier implications. Note, these implications are not just on one level. they have multiple levels of implications, and they do snowball like an avalanche. So go and take a look at this video. It will be in the playlist. You can also use this URL you see on the screen here to move into the video. Human impact that we talked about earlier, economic impacts of living by the coast. Why do people live by the sea? Right? This, if I'm not wrong, this is a case study on Miami, right? Which, as you all know, is the sun, the sand, and the sea, right? So Miami, what happens when you have water rising, when you have sea level rising, when you have climate change threatening your coastline? What are the mitigation measures that they have put in? What are the measures that they have given up on? Are there areas that they understand it's not going to be sustainable in the future? What about Singapore? Singapore is an island country. Okay, so can you imagine if the sea level rises 2 meters in the next 20 years, or even 1 meter in the next 20 years, right? How much of our land will be lost? What is the government doing to this? Earlier on, we talked about crops. Droughts is only one of them, but drought is an easier way to visualize this issue, because drought is a situation where you have no water. What happens when your plants don't have water? It's like, many of the teachers have plants in their staff room, but lo and behold, when you go for the end of the year break and they don't water the plants for a good 4 weeks, next year they buy new plants. Okay, so keep this in mind. This video, once again, will be in your playlist. It is useful. Okay, now, is it all economical? Actually, it isn't. Now, you have to understand that a place of residence, place of work, place of education doesn't only have an economic value. There are also social impacts, or social value, or things that emotions that people have vested in these places. And what happens when these places are destroyed or lost, right? So the emotional impact, the social impact is also very important. And climate change, when devastation from climate change happen, it doesn't discern. It doesn't say, okay, I'm just going to hurt you economically, right? Your emotional side, I'm not going to hurt because you are all sensitive and all, right? It doesn't come around that way. So everything is hit. So economic impacts. This is an island nation. What happens when the island nation is now underwater? What will happen to their nationality? Will they have to evacuate to another country? Which country will be willing to accept this bunch of refugees? Right? So island nations are peculiar. They're very, very sensitive to this climate change impacts. And once again, Singapore is an island nation. So only thing going for us is we do fortunately have some resources available, and so we are able to do some early mitigation for sea level rise, and we have continuing this journey. The government is continuing on this journey, and we're now looking at empoldering, okay, doing polders like what Holland does, okay, to hopefully help mitigate the problem of sea level rise. So with this concept here, I think this section, what we need to be very clear of is the idea that climate change is a threat multiplier. Okay, so it doesn't only bring one layer of threats. There are also subsequent layers that are snowballed upon, and as a result, it doesn't just hit one area of global life. Okay, so what you see here is a flowchart for ocean pollution and coral bleaching. So when you have ocean pollution, what does it do? It actually creates a situation where your corals can no longer survive. But climate change is another one that tightens this situation. So ocean pollution on its own is already causing coral bleaching. But when you have climate change coming in, right, it multiplies this threat. So the threat of coral bleaching is now heightened. It happens at a faster pace. It happens at a wider area. Okay, at the area that is threatened is larger. The species that are threatened becomes larger. What that implies further on is who lives at the coral areas. It's actually the very young and your marine fish and your coral fish, and the ecosystem that actually provides a lot of the sustenance, right? That the entire ecosystem in the ocean needs. So your marine yield, what you can harvest from the sea, will drop. What would that mean? That would mean that the fishermen will have poverty. Okay, they have lesser to harvest. The ability to earn a living like the past will no longer be there. So this is what we're looking at when we talk about threat multiplier. how climate change comes in. So it may not be always the case where climate change itself brings the main problem. It will still bring the main problem, but it could also heighten existing problems that are already there and make things even worse, right? So if you can deal with climate change itself, you can mitigate it or you can reduce it to a point where it is not so significant, then all these subsequent threats that it helps to multiply and make worse will be at a lesser state, right? So if you look at the SLS itself, they also have a couple of other examples, right? This one is dealing with large-scale deforestation. How does it mess around with our water cycle, and how does it actually eventually lead to impacts on rainfall, impacts on climatic change, and worsening the situation? Okay, so the second one here is what we talked about earlier on the flowchart with ocean pollution, coral bleaching, and eventually creating a state of poverty. Okay, so similarly, if you are talking about climate change in terms of an urban area, right, when you have poor drainage, okay, stagnant pools of water, these will promote the growth of mosquitoes and spread of mosquito-borne mosquito vector diseases or diseases that spread by mosquitoes, like for example malaria, or in our context, one that's more pertinent will be dengue fever, okay, and sometimes Zika. So when you have climate change, how does this multiplier effect come about? When you have climate change, you have even more rainfall, right? You have warmer temperatures and even more rainfall. So warmer temperatures alone will encourage insects to propagate at a faster pace. More rain equals to more stagnant water, equals to more chance of mosquitoes breeding, equals to worsening of the spread of all these mosquito-borne diseases, like once again, malaria, Zika, dengue fever. So hopefully these three images in your SLS actually gives you some sort of clarity on this idea of multiplier effect. Okay. Now you need to however be clear that there are differences in terms of how this threat multiplier uh, morphs in different situations and different areas. Why? Because these differences based on stage of development that the place is will have a different level of mitigation ability. Okay, so there are always going to be disadvantaged communities. So we think about climate change, and you go back to the video that you should have watched, which we mentioned earlier, on the Fijian Islands. What can Singapore do that Fiji cannot? Okay, what are the resources that the Singapore government and the Singapore population is privileged enough to experience that the Fijians don't? And as a result, what is the implication on them? So this is important. When you are looking at developing countries, one key thing to note is they are developing. They do not have the same amount of economic ability, and they do not have the same amount of resources in terms of economic resources and technological resources. So when you don't have this kind of financial ability to put in your mitigation measures, you suffer the full brunt of the impact of climate change. So similarly, the multiplier effect that these places suffer from will be full force. What about Singapore? Are we a developing country? Right? Being the only developed country in Southeast Asia, I guess has its perks. Disadvantaged communities. Now, in Singapore, if you've been here all your life, it is really not easy to have exposure to disadvantaged communities. Having said that, I think we all need to be very clear that there are disadvantaged communities in Singapore, and there are people who are living in real poverty in Singapore as well. However, where you tend to come from, it is not common. It is not something in your daily life. So you will not be able to understand, oh, there's climate change, there's global warming. I just crank up my air conditioner a bit more, right? At night it's really warm, it's 29 degrees, 30 degrees, but it's not 30 degrees in my room. My room is 21 degrees, right? It's perfectly temperatured for bedtime. But that's because you are not a disadvantaged community. What about people who are on the streets? Right? In certain countries where your disadvantaged communities are out there in the open. Okay, what about in Singapore? People who are living in rental housing, do they have air conditioning? Right, in the middle of June, where temperatures are ridiculous nowadays, what happens to them? Okay, what are the risks involved for these people, right? Overseas, in terms of heat waves, flooding, tropical storms. When you don't have shelter, when you are living in the streets, what happens when the streets are flooded? Okay, what happens to all of your possessions, right? So with limited financial ability, you will be less able to cope with all these other implications, right? And when you talk about poverty, they are the ones who are hit worse. When you talk about lower food quantum produced, right, lower food yield, they are the ones who will suffer the most, because when you already have very little money for food and the food prices go up, you just have no choice but to eat lesser food. Okay, so lack of means to see a doctor. But if you get hit by malaria, you can't afford medication. So these are the two biggest problems that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at disadvantaged groups. So I've actually created a little bit of a video that here to hopefully give you an awareness of what disadvantaged communities in Singapore look like. So this video here, you will see a couple of homeless people, some young, some old, and take a look at what their living condition actually is. Think about it. If climate change and the implications of climatic conditions worsen, you get a lot more rain, you get a lot more wind, you get flooding. What will happen to these people? These are Singaporeans, okay? These are Singaporeans living in Singapore, right? So take a look at this video. It will also be in the playlist. So in summary for this second section here, right, a couple of things for you to think about, right? Number one, how does climate change hinder sustainable development? Does it really hinder? Okay, what happens when you have to spend money dealing with all these things? Okay, how have we looked at climate change as the threat multiplier? Are you able to then give me a couple of examples, be it the flooding one, be it the one about ocean pollution and coral bleaching, or be it the one about the loss of deforestation and loss of your carbon sinks, right? So which one would you feel more comfortable with explaining if it comes out as a question on describing how climate change is a threat multiplier? Finally, I hope the videos will give you a good perspective on how developing countries and disadvantaged communities specifically are more impacted by this threat multiplier effect. Okay, so I'm not sitting on a high horse and trying to tell you that you need to be aware, you need to try and do something to help, but I think we all need to take some action to help the disadvantaged communities around us. Okay, so we will go on to the next section in the next video.